Our guest presenter is Bill Mowry. Hi, Bill. Bill serves with the Navigators Church Ministries in Columbus, Ohio. His passion is to help leaders build Great Commission cultures marked by intentionality, relationships, creativity, and generations of disciples makers. In his book, The Ways of the Leader, he unpacks 4 competencies for everyday leaders in churches, ministries, communities, and businesses. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation. And I always look forward to settings like this. And it's too bad we couldn't do it in person. So, we actually could have a little relationship going, but screen to screen is better than nothing at all. So thanks again. And as Judy mentioned, what I'd like to do is just kind of give an overview of the book, I guess, looking at its theme and some of the component parts and offering some explanations, and then open it up for a discussion. And if Judy, maybe you could monitor the questions that come in the chat room and ask me then, and I guess others can join in as we do this. And I know ever since COVID, we've all learned to adjust to communicating through Zoom chats and other means of, social media communication, but it's still missing that personal touch. But we'll try to get as much of that in as we can tonight. So thanks again for your interest in my book, The Ways of the Leader. And by way of introduction, let me introduce kind of the theme of the book in this way. And picture yourself on a tennis court, and you're getting in some practice hitting the balls. And so you've got the ball machine kind of all wound up, and it's full of balls, and it throws the first one at you, and you hit the first one over the net. And then you're getting ready to set in your stance again, and then it throws another one at you, then another one, and then another one. And you don't have any time to get set in your stances. And I think that's a little bit what leadership is like today, right? We're getting thrown one ball after another, and we don't have time to reset, and we don't have time to figure out how do we hit that ball back. In my book, I discuss briefly kind of 3 current challenges that I think leaders face, at least the leaders I'm involved with and from my own experience. And obviously, we can add to this list, but let me suggest 3 of them. One challenge we face is that we just live in the fast lane these days. That everything seems to be changing fast. Life is changing fast. Our cell phones continue to change fast. And just think about, over the last 3 years, probably none of us here were talking about AI. But now it's a subject of every conversation. My son is a professional illustrator, and AI is very much on his mind because AI has absorbed a lot of his artwork. And so that we're caught in the speed, this fastball of speed. A second fastball is, I'm borrowing it from an author, he calls it the black swan. And the black swan is that up until, a couple hundred years ago, the assumption in Western Europe is that there were only white swans. But then they discovered black swans in Australia. And so a black swan is kind of this unexpected, interruption to life as usual. In other words, we can make some assumptions that the way things are going now will be the way things are going in the future. For example, we just had a black swan thrown in the whole political arena in the last month or so. Who would have said 6 to 8 weeks ago, or maybe a little longer, that President Biden would not be running for president? Wow, things have now changed, that we make some assumptions that things will be the same, but we're throwing these black swans and things change. And how do we deal with that as leaders? A third one is that we are growing to be a culturally diverse nation. And the reality is, no matter where we side on the politics on this thing, the culture of the United States is changing in terms of becoming much more diverse. And so leaders, again, how do we meet that challenge? That has all kinds of implications for us, not only in the church, but in society as a whole. So how do we meet those challenges? How do we address that? Like, for example, I had a conversation with my editor. I'm working on my next book with her, and she is Hispanic. And I said, well, our publishing company, I wonder, are they doing anything to address the growing Hispanic church in our country? What are we doing in terms of marketing materials, developing materials for this growing Hispanic community? And again, that's a change. It's kind of this ball of change that's been thrown at us again. And what we're discovering as leaders, at least what I'm discovering, is that there aren't any quick fixes to any of these balls, are there? And neither are there what I call portable franchises. I think in the church, we love to import franchises into our local church. It's kind of like starting a McDonald's. We buy a franchise into McDonald's because, hey, the franchise, we know exactly the kind of hamburger we're going to get. We know exactly how much of a milkshake we're going to get, and the fries are all going to taste the same. And a lot of times in the church, and I work with churches and pastors on a regular basis, our longing is that, boy, if it works in one church, let's put it in our church. It's kind of like bringing in a franchise. Well, we're finding that, hey, a lot of times those franchises don't meet the needs and the challenges our local church faces. And so the other kind of quick fix we look for, and in some ways I might fall under this category, I call them intellectual mercenaries. In other words, that we're paying somebody else to think for us and to figure things out for us. So we go to the latest seminar, we hire the latest consultant, we read the latest book, like my book, and we assume that somebody's going to tell us what to do and how to solve these challenges we're facing. Well, it seems like the ultimate challenge is that how can local leaders develop local solutions or strategies for local challenges? So, how can local leaders develop local solutions and strategies for local challenges? And that's the theme of this book. In that, in one sense, I want to help, I want to communicate some principles that allows you as leaders to begin to think, in a sense, for yourself. Not that you're not thinking for yourself, I don't mean that in a demeaning way, but to perhaps give you some tools and ways for you to come up with local solutions to local challenges for you as a local leader. And that's where I'm coming from tonight. And that's where the theme of the book is. The other theme of the book is realizing that sometimes we don't need quick fix answers. We need wisdom in how to make the best choices. And the Bible speaks to wisdom a lot, doesn't it? It's kind of interesting in the book of Proverbs, which we would call kind of the book of wisdom, is that wisdom is often personified as a woman. It's kind of like Lady Wisdom becomes our partner in figuring out, Lord, how do you want us to deal with these local challenges as local leaders to come up with local solutions? So sometimes it's not simply importing something from somewhere else, but Lord, to give us a sense of wisdom on what's the right thing to do. Now, one of the things I've done in the book, and this is just, it helps me because we can, the Bible is, like in James 1:5, he exhorts us, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives wisdom to us. And again, in the book of James, wisdom is described in the book of James. And so what I've tried to do in the book is to give a simple definition, not so much a definition, a description of what wisdom is. That is, how do we know when we have it, and how do we know when we need to use it? And so, a simple description I've come up with wisdom is that wisdom is the skill to choose what is good and what is right. It's a skill to choose what is good and what is right. And the word skill, actually, the word wisdom in the book of Proverbs, the Hebrew word, actually means the idea of skill. Some would say that wisdom in Proverbs is the idea of skillful living. And so, for example, about a year ago, we had our bathroom remodeled, and so we had the tile guys come in, and they had a certain amount of skill or wisdom in how to tile a bathroom, skill and wisdom that I didn't have. In other words, from experience, from their training, they could skillfully and wisely make adjustments, lay the tile, leave us with really a nice looking bathroom. They were wise in how they do that. It was a skill that they had. And so wisdom then is developing that skill to choose what is good and what is right. And so by what's good is what is it that gives life and what is it that nourishes people? And probably the majority of you out there are parents. And so as parents, we think about our children, and we have two adult sons and two grandchildren. And so as we were parenting our children, we were thinking about what is it that's going to give our children life? What's going to nourish them? But also at the same time, we want to do what is right. And wisdom particularly in Proverbs, is pictured as God's kind of moral standard of righteousness. And so I think of righteousness as being what is fair and what's just. What's fair and what's just. And so, how do I make decisions that impart fairness and justice to the people who are being most affected by them? And so, wisdom then is that skill to choose what's good, what is it that's going to give life and nourish people, as well as wisdom is how do I make sure that it's right, it's done in fairness and in justice. And so now, again, let me just make a little side comment on this. That, as you know, in the book of Proverbs, it repeatedly, several times, says that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And I don't know about you, but I often thought, yeah, how do you reconcile that if I'm to call, God my Father, where does fear fit into this mix? And so for those of you in Arizona, you might like this illustration. And several years ago, my family visited the Grand Canyon, right? And we had younger boys at the time. And so you get to the Grand Canyon, you get the guardrail. I forget now which end of the canyon we were on, but you're standing behind this guardrail. And if you've had boys, young boys, what do boys tend to do when you get into a situation like this? And I don't think my sons were atypical. They pretended to push each other over the edge, right? And my wife would, oh, don't do that. And that's all. They're just having fun. But so that when you look at the Grand Canyon, kind of behind that guardrail, this thing is so beautiful. It's so majestic. It just kind of pulls you in, right? It's almost like you either physically or emotionally or mentally, you're leaning forward to embrace it all. It's so majestic. It just is so beautiful. It's just pulling you in and you want to embrace all of it. But then you look down, right? And it's almost like you take a step back and you realize, on the one hand, this is so beautiful and majestic. But the other hand, this is kind of a little different for me. There's an element of danger here. And so that I have a healthy respect for the Grand Canyon. And I have an enjoyment of its beauty and its wonder. And I thought, to me, that's a little bit like what it means to fear God. Well, I want to embrace all of his beauty, all of his goodness, all of his majesty. But, he is different for me. He's our Father, but he's in heaven. And we're to sanctify his name. And so that wisdom then is that element of kind of realizing that, I sometimes I stand small before a big God and I just need his wisdom. I need to ask him to help me in whatever situation I'm in, and particularly for us as leaders, that we're facing local challenges maybe we've never faced before, and we need to trust God to ask for wisdom. How do we come up with local solutions, local strategies to help meet these challenges? Now, the theme of the book, and one way of illustrating this, is that it's kind of like wisdom, I think, is like an investment. We have a portfolio of investments, and our goal is how can we grow that portfolio? How to, in one sense, make it a little larger and a little bigger? And so it is with wisdom. How do we grow the wisdom that we inherently have? And so that I'd like to suggest, and this is the thrust of the book, is that here's 4 practices that can help you grow wisdom. And there are things, again, that any leader with some help can begin to do. And that as I grow these practices, they help me as a local leader in my local setting, help me to think and pray and work with others to come up with local solutions. And so that I'm not writing a book to give you solutions to these challenges, but to give you some principles that might help you design, kind of figure out before God, what are the solutions for my local setting. So there's 4 of them, and let me start with the first one. And the first one, and by the way, I phrase these as ways. And so when I think of a way, you think about, well, there's a way that I can travel to Tucson, Arizona, right? And so a way is kind of a direction, it's a route. At the same time, if you got to know me, you'd say, boy, there's a way about Bill. There's a way about how he does things. And so a way is also a characteristic of who we are. It's kind of a descriptor. And so as I use this word way, I see it not so much as a way of traveling, but a descriptor about who we are. They become qualities of our lives and of our leadership. And so the first way is a way of being a lifelong learner. All right. Now, this is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. It's an obscure verse, I realize, and it's in the book of Ecclesiastes, an even more obscure place, but it's Ecclesiastes 4:13. It says that better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. or one translation says how to receive instruction. And I thought it's an interesting comparison, isn't it? Because you have a poor, but he's a wise youth. And then you have this rich, powerful king, but he or she is foolish. And so that, what would you rather be? Kind of having all the power, but we foolish, or the poor but wise youth? And by implication, the king doesn't know how to take instruction. And so by implication, the youth is wise because he or she knows how to take instruction. And so it is that in my own life, I want to be always in a position where I'm learning. I'm taking instruction from settings. Now, I quote a poem in my book. I don't quote the whole poem, but it's a quote from a poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and I love this. And you can pick up some of the biblical images in this quote. And she writes, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around it and pluck blackberries." Okay, so you had the picture of the burning bush, right? Moses before the burning bush. And so the earth is crammed with heaven. And so, like that burning bush, God shows up. Earth is crammed with heaven, the presence of God. And every common bush, and it says a common bush, is a fire with God. And so, in the common things, God can show up. In the common places of life, God can show up. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. That is, if you remember, God instructed Moses, take his sandals off, his shoes off, because he's coming into this holy presence. And so when we spot God showing up, it's kind of we symbolically take off our shoes. We recognize that, hey, God's here. But a lot of people just sit around and pluck blackberries. Often thought about, for some of us that, may share my age, that if you remember shopping in the supermarkets a number of years ago, you used to have the magazine called the National Enquirer, right? And I don't know whether it's replaced with these days, but inevitably, a number of years ago, oftentimes they'd had the lead story that Elvis showed up at the local Walmart. Remember those kind of stories? Elvis showed up at the local Walmart. And so everybody's surprised. They thought he was dead. And I think that's a little bit like what God is. God shows up in these unexpected places. And I think as lifelong learners, we begin to realize that all of life is a classroom, that my life and my ministry, all that's involved in that is kind of God's classroom for me. Am I taking the time, though, and learning from it? Am I taking the time to kind of stop, think, and reflect? Now, one of the ways that this is, learning happens, and one author calls it's reflection on action learning. It's reflection on action. Let me give you an example. Up until a couple of years ago, I was satisfied with bad haircuts, and then my wife encouraged me to go to her hairstylist and to get a better haircut. And so I met LaQuinta, and we got to talking, and over several times of getting several haircuts we got to know each other. And I found out that she was on the side a life coach. And so I was, I'm a coach as well. So that got us talking. And besides, she really did give a good haircut. And so I asked her one day, I said, LaQuinta, you've been cutting hair for a long time. What have you learned about people, by cutting hair? And she goes, man, I have learned so much about people by cutting hair. She says, here's one great example. She said, I'm more and more men are coming in to get their hair done by me. And she says, and I've had to figure out how do I connect with men? And she says, well, I figured out that at least now I live in Columbus, Ohio, right? And if any of you are football fans, Columbus, Ohio is the home of the Ohio State University. And so football is on everybody's mind in this city. And she says, to connect with men, I found out I had to learn to talk about football. And so I started learning about the Buckeyes. And then I got into the NFL. And she says, I got so excited about football. I watch it now more than my husband does. And she said that, so I found that I've got to find things of common interest with people who may be different than me. And those are the things that then gives me opportunities for conversation with people. I've also seen that the things I learned in, kind of her training, that says those things really don't work out in the real world in a lot of ways. If I had to mentor somebody else, I'd really do some things differently because of what I learned in practice than what I would have done in school. So do you see what she's done? she's turned her job, that is, cutting and styling hair on a daily basis, into kind of a classroom to learn about people. Now, what prompted that exchange is I just began to ask her some questions and she started talking. And so you've seen that even with yourself or with others. It's kind of like as we begin to ask questions about our life, about what's going on, we begin to see that, hey, I've learned some things. In your congregations, the word expert and experience have very similar meanings in their original, Latin meanings. And so that because you have people who have experience, some of them are experts. Now, they become an expert when they begin to reflect on the experience that they had. As well as I do, I've had experience in installing tile in my home. I tried it in my previous home and it didn't work out so well. So that's why I paid somebody else who's a skilled expert to come in and do it in my home. Now, just because I had the experience doesn't mean I'm an expert. But I would like to suggest that if we help people and ourselves begin to reflect on the experience that we have, we can begin to identify those lessons that we've learned about life. So, in other words, in your congregations, you have people that are probably experts in small groups because they've had experience in small groups. You have experts in raising children, experts on parenting, experts in certain career opportunities, and etc. But part of it is that we've got to help people and ourselves as leaders to begin to stop and reflect on the action on God's, kind of this classroom that God's placed us in. Particularly, if you're in the pastorate, to take time to start thinking about what have I learned? And you could open up the question, what have I learned about, relating to people? What have I learned about prayer? What have I learned about organization? We can ask all kinds of questions because that experience, that classroom has been your experience in your ministry. And I like to suggest that that is a source of wisdom for us, but we've got to stop and reflect upon it. So everyday life is God's classroom. We need to stop and reflect on life to extract wisdom from experience. And in the book, I talk about 4 simple things to do to help you to do that. And I won't get into them now. I'll let you buy the book and find out why. No, not really. But 4 simple things. I just need to stop. I just need to stop, right? And then I need to explore. And I explore by asking questions. And then I come up with, after I explored, I've asked some questions, I want to save some of the things that kind of principles I've come up with. And then I want to think, how do I, act upon these? How do I do? And so lifelong learning happens when we see that all of life, all of ministry is God's classroom. God shows up. He's got experience. He's got lessons he wants to teach us. We need to stop. We need to explore. We need to save, and we need to do. For example, I've come up with 4 senior maxims, and some of you that are seniors, you may appreciate this, but I've come up with 4 senior maxims, and one is that life's too short for more paperwork, right? And life's just too short for more paperwork. When I was I'm no longer in a supervisory position, but when I was in a supervisory position with the navigators with staff, I decided that I'm not going to ask people to fill out any paperwork that I wasn't willing to read and hopefully talk with them about. Because I thought, how many times have I been asked by different organizations, fill something out, and you wonder, is anybody ever going to read this? Life's just too short for more paperwork. Also, life's too short for more meetings. I don't want to spend my life in meetings. So life's too short for more meetings. Third one is life's too short to work with people I don't like. I mean, people that people that I don't have chemistry with. And by that I mean that we all know that, hey, we're placed in situations where we're working with challenging people, and maybe we're some of these challenging people ourselves. And that, but if I had the option of choosing people that I want to work with, I'd like to work with people I have chemistry with. This doesn't mean we're best friends, but we respect each other and we can work together. Now, my 4th life maxim is that life's too short to place myself in knowingly embarrassing situations, like playing golf. So there's certain things anymore that I've decided that I'm not going to do. Life's too short place myself in knowingly embarrassing situations. So these are just some simple life maxims and that I've learned from life. I had another friend that really had an ability. He was kind of my mentor for a period of time to capture some life maxims. Now here's 2 of them. And this is learning from life. One is that sometimes when you give people the benefit of the doubt's not really a benefit. Okay, think about that for a minute. Sometimes when you give people the benefit of the doubt's not really a benefit. And so that, again, we've all been in there. We think, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. Well, sometimes it's not a benefit to us and may really not be a benefit to them. They're just not in the right place at the right time, whatever it might be. But this is what I'm describing is one of the outcomes is we kind of create these little life maxims that we've learned about life. And I know probably all of you have them. And if I were to interview some of your children, I'd probably learn them from your children and grandchildren. But to build up the store of wisdom, we need to be lifelong learners, extracting wisdom from life. Okay, here's a second way that I talk about in the book. And this is the way of collaborative leading, the way of collaborative leading. And by, collaborative leading, let me explain it this way. In my responsibilities with the Navigators, over the years I've been involved in a variety of ministries from college students to graduate students and faculty in the business community, in the medical community with physicians and dentists for the last 15 years with pastors and church leaders. And I used to be guilty of what I had a friend called the sin of omnicompetence. That is, assuming that I had to be competent in everything and that I, as a leader, had to do everything well. And so, one of the things that we would do in the Navigators and collegiate ministries is we would invite students for a summer program for about 8 weeks, and where they would get a job during the day and they'd be involved in Bible studies, different things in the evenings. And you can imagine what that's like to have 60, call it 19 to 21-year-olds, in a house together and trying to manage that whole thing. And I had a team that was helping me. And boy, as the summer went along, I realized I didn't know what to do in a whole lot of situations. My attitude was often like this. And a little bit of an aside. In We used to when we interviewed new staff coming on staff, the Navigators, that we would come up with questions to ask. And you undoubtedly have your own set of questions that you use to interview people in whatever, particularly for positions. And as we were as a staff team talking about questions we want to ask, one of the men says, "Hey, here's a great question. Why do we ask them to identify who's their favorite cartoon character and why?" Okay, we all laughed about that, but I thought, that's an interesting question. We're going to ask that of this applicant, applying for the job. And I thought to myself, so who is a cartoon character that I would most often identify as a leader? All right. Let me see if this shows up on my screen here. Some of you that may remember him, some of you that may be old enough. Remember Mighty Mouse? And Mighty Mouse was, this cute little mouse guy, looks like Mickey Mouse in tights, and that's built, and he always yells out, "Here I come to save the day," right? And I thought, yeah, that's kind of my attitude as a leader, the omnicompetent leader. Here I come to save the day. And well, what I found out over the course of that summer at the summer program, through this team of people with me, it changed from here I come to here we come to save the day. That together we could do a better job than I could do by myself on my own. And so I had to kind of renounce that sin of omnicompetence and say, well, Lord, thank you for bringing these people around me. And together as a team, we're going to do a whole lot better job than any one of us could do as an individual. So it's no longer here I come to save the day, but here we come to save the day. And so collaborative leadership, and again, I want to emphasize here, it's one type of leadership. Sometimes we can exalt it to be, the only form of leadership. Well, it's one type of leadership. And the collaborative leadership, I think, most likely works well when there's a big challenge facing us. Maybe we need a new approach we haven't tried before. Maybe we have to honestly admit that nothing's working, or that we see that we really need ownership from people and from my congregation for this issue that we're facing. And that's when collaborative leadership, I think, is best, used and utilized. I like to think of collaborative leadership is that together, and particularly if you're a pastor or a lay leader, you may end up being the collaborative leader yourself. I like to think of it as we're coming to the table with a blank sheet of paper. We're coming to a table with a blank sheet of paper. Well, all of us are saying, hey, I don't know. This is really a big issue. How are we going to deal with it? And so together, we're going to fill in this blank sheet of paper. We're going to ask God for wisdom. We're going to draw upon our experiences, and we're going to draw upon, we're going to do an assessment, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to trust God to fill in this blank sheet of paper. To me, that's collaborative leadership, that we're working together. We're drawing on the wisdom of the community. Remember, again, the need is for wisdom, and that you're inviting wise people into the setting. And so you're drawing in the wisdom of that community to fill in the pages of that blank paper. Now, one of the things I found that, particularly working in churches, and this is true of any situation, and it can be true of us, that people come in with agendas and preferences, and they want to influence things. And one of the things that passages I often talk about with people is in Philippians chapter 2. And Paul describes his protege, Timothy. It says that, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare, for they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. And so that when I invite people into a collaborative setting, I'll tell them, I'm inviting you to kind of, not that you disregard all of your preferences and agendas, but lay them aside so that together we might create something that's really new, that's maybe different, or maybe is better, or is complementary, or it incorporates some of those preferences and agendas you have. But then we've got to put those aside because we're trusting God to kind of fill in this blank piece of paper. And so we're laying our agendas at the table. Just to let you know that I actually do apply these things in my own life. I've been tasked in my local church to what we realized we worship about 1,200 on a Sunday morning. And I happened to look through the church directory one day and I started counting up the people that I thought were 65 years and older. And I may have done disservice to some of them, but I figured out of our church, we had probably about 300 so people that were 65 and older. In other words, a good fourth, maybe even a third of our church are 65 and older. But there is not a single staff person or leader that represents, a third of the church. And so I approached our pastoral staff on this, and they ended up asking me if I'd like to do some of that work. And so, never make an observation without your willingness to make a contribution. And so I said, well, I don't want to be the leader. I want to facilitate, what a senior ministry would look like. And so that I pulled together a team of people, a diverse team of people, of seniors. And so we've been meeting first to kind of, as seniors, we want to assess where we are. We want to begin to describe, hey, what's this picture of a successful senior ministry look like? Then from that picture and identification of our needs, what are some goals we want to set? And then what are some action steps we want to take? And so that my goal is to draw on the wisdom of this community, not to impose what I think we should do to minister to seniors, because I really don't know myself, even though I'm a senior. And I figure there's wisdom in the community, and how do we collaborate together? And so that we need a simple game plan. And in my book, I talk about a game plan that starts with selecting the right people to collaborate together. Remember, my third maxim is that I want to work with people I have a sense of chemistry with. And so, myself and another pastor, we talked about who we'd like to invite, selected some people, and I call it, we take a pause. And I ask people, I want to encourage you we're going to trust God to create something new, but I want you to lay aside for the moment your agendas and your preferences so we can be free to see how can we create something that doesn't exist. And then we focused, we're targeting people approximately 65 years and older. We want to explore some possibilities, and then we want to begin to develop a plan that we then execute. And so, I'm practicing this myself in a local church, and I've done it in other settings within the Navigators. And so it's a way of collaborative leadership, and that we're drawing on the wisdom of the many. And so it is in this era of change that we live in. We're trying to figure out, how do I hit that tennis ball of change across the net? We need other people to do this together, and that means collaboration. Now, my third way is a way of cultural wisdom. So we're talking about kind of four ways to build this portfolio of wisdom to deepen our sense of wisdom. We need to be lifelong learners. We need to be collaborative leaders, and we need to be people of cultural wisdom. And that, I'll give you an example of my wife, Peggy. Yeah, a number of years ago, Peggy decided that for a number of reasons that she was teaching in a Christian school at the time, and that she would quit teaching in a Christian school and get a job in a corporate setting. And so she ended up actually landing a job in a Fortune 100 company. And she soon noticed that from the first day on a Monday morning when she walked into the corporate headquarters for training, this was a whole lot different. This is a whole different culture than that Christian school that she had left. In the Christian school, there's a spirit of cooperation. Corporate setting, hey, it's competition. In the Christian school, there's a sense of, hey, people were supporting you. And in the corporate setting, it's kind of like, hey, you got to train, you got to move forward, you got to compete. In other words, it's a very different culture she found herself in. And she realized very quickly that I had to learn this culture. I had to understand this new setting, this new context that I was in. Because if she didn't understand it, she wouldn't be able to communicate. She wouldn't be able to connect with people. She wouldn't be able to do her job well. And that she had needed cultural wisdom. That is, give me insight into this particular culture that I'm involved in. In this case, it was a corporate culture that was different from the previous culture that she was involved in. And so let me, in a simple way, and again, in a group this diverse, I know there's lots of different understandings about what culture is and etc. And so I've just made a simple little definition that culture is a group of people who share a common language, common values, common history or story, and common practices. And so, for example, in my ministry to churches, I work with Lutheran churches, I work with Methodist churches, I work with Vineyard churches, I work with Baptist churches, Presbyterian churches, Nazarene churches. All of those churches have a culture to them. In other words, that they have a common language, that there's ways they talk about church life, the ways they talk about God. There's a common language there. They have some shared values together. They have a shared history or story, whether it's a denominational history or story where we point to the founder of our denomination, such as the Methodist Church, or it could be a local independent church. They have a story, they have a history, and then all of them, they have some common practices, things that we share doing together. And so part of understanding, gaining cultural wisdom is understanding those common languages, values, history, stories, and practices. I'd like to suggest too that as we think about culture, there's what I call this macro culture. You could also call this a dominant culture. And then there's micro cultures, that is smaller cultures. In fact, if you were to visit my family, you discover our family has a little culture in and of itself. That we have a common language, we have some values we have as a family. There's a story, we pass on these stories, and there's some common practices. And again, a microculture could be a neighborhood, could be a workplace. There's a variety of settings in which these micro and macro cultures exist. And so, why do we need cultural wisdom? And let me just quote from an author. He's one of my favorite authors over the last few years. His name is he's a novelist, he's a poet, and he's an agrarian philosopher. And his name is Wendell Berry. If anyone is familiar with Wendell Berry out there, and but Berry makes this statement. He gives an example of the importance of cultural wisdom, and it's regarding farming. All right, so Berry is a farmer in Kentucky, and so let me just quote from the book here. It says, novelist and agrarian philosopher Wendell Berry writes that good farmers consult the genius of the place. They consult the genius of the place. And so by genius, he means the prevalent quality of a culture or place. Farmers become students of the land in order, according to Berry, to ask what nature would permit them to do there and what they could do there with the least harm to the place and to the natural and human neighbors. So, in other words, I'm studying the place, and this is kind of, again, he resonates with my definition of wisdom because I've got to ask the land, what's it going to permit me to do there? And what's going to do the least harm to the place? What's going to treat it justly and fairly, and to the natural and human neighbors? So, in other words, he has another statement that we farm the farm that's given to us. And by the way, this has been a reassuring thought to many pastors. And think of it this way, if I move to Arizona, I am not going to plan necessarily a snow cone factory in the middle of Arizona. That I'm not going to grow rice in Arizona. Same thing if I moved to Newfoundland, I'm not going to grow pineapples. That we farm, we fit the farm to the land that's given to us. And that's what Barry is saying. And to do that, we've got to study that land. And so Barry goes on, he says, farmers' knowledge of their land enables them to what? Tend farms that they know and love using tools and methods that they know and love. Since a farmer knows and loves their place, intelligent farmers who desire the long-term success of farming adapt their work to their places. This means fitting the farming to the land. Out of love, the farmer wisely adapts tools, methods, and expectations to the land they farm. And so it is with us, like the example of your church sits in a neighborhood. And so that what do you know about the culture of your neighborhood? What are the people around you? What's the language that they have? What's the values that they share? Is there a story behind your neighborhood? How it was developed, maybe mismanaged, whatever it might be. And then are some common practices to your neighborhood. And so as a church, how do we love the land that we're involved in? And to do that, we just need cultural wisdom. We need an understanding what that culture is like. And in my book, I give a little matrix for a kind of understanding culture. But here's another way of picturing how do we gain cultural wisdom. And I use the analogy that we need to become cultural detectives, kind of like Sherlock Holmes. And so that, how can you be a Sherlock Holmes in your neighborhood, workplace, in your church itself? And what did Sherlock Holmes, master detective, do? By the way, he's the most quoted detective or mentioned detective in all of kind of Western European literature. But what did he do? He made observations, he asked questions, and then he formed deductions. And so it is with us. If we're going to grow in cultural wisdom, we need to be people who are making observations. Like in my neighborhood, what I've observed in my neighborhood is that I think out of the 10 houses at the end of my block, we're the only one that I know of that leaves for church on a Sunday morning. Yeah, it's just an observation. And I've had conversations with our neighbors about topics of faith. And I found out some of the reasons why they don't go to church, what they think about God, because I've asked questions. And then I formed some deductions. And so cultural wisdom is kind of this process. It's an ability to understand the setting, the culture around me. And I do that by being a cultural detective where I observe, ask questions, and deduce. And again, the book provides a matrix of some questions to use. All right, so we looked at 3 out of my 4 ways. What are they again? You want to be a lifelong learner. You want to be a collaborative leader. You want to be a cultural detective, so you're growing cultural wisdom. And the 4th one is you want to be a ministry innovator. This is a way of innovation, the way of innovation. And let me preface this or open this conversation by, I am a Mac user, and I have only used Macintosh, Mac computers, yeah, since day one. I got hooked on it. And so I've always been intrigued with the story of Steve Jobs. And so let me read you a little bit about Steve Jobs from my book that I drew from another book that, and because I think it teaches us some things about innovation. Steve Jobs revolutionized the product design industry by marrying aesthetics or something of beauty and function. In other words, could we have a beautifully designed product without sacrificing its purpose? A beautifully designed form, that is the appearance of a computer, should fit the computer's functions, what it does. So he married aesthetics and function, and he transformed product design, a change we're still benefiting from today. Now, again, just walk into a typical Target store, any kind of store, you see these kind of beautifully designed objects now that populate our homes, but they haven't lost their function. There's this marriage of kind of something beautiful along with the function that it has. So designing something beautiful meant keeping it simple. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, Jobs declared. Simplicity showed up in the Mac's design, but something else also drove Jobs' passion. The main thing in our design is that we have to make things intuitively obvious. We recently bought about 2 years ago a new Honda car, and while I love so many features of it, I love the drive. It is not user friendly. I have no idea what's going on the screen in front of me, and it's just not simply my age that doesn't disqualify me. I've talked to salesmen and say I don't know what's going on either. So in other words, it's not intuitively obvious. It's not something simple to be used. Something that's a quality innovation is something that's simple to be used. So then he goes on, and at the end, it says that let's see now, Jobs scrutinized the computer circuit board. In other words, when you take the cover off the computer, you see the circuit board. Jobs, scrutinized this. He wanted to take something purely functional and design it to be as beautiful as possible, even if it's inside the box. So in other words, all those little wires, all those little gadgets in there, he wanted them to have a design that would be beautiful to look at, even though nobody would see it. The author explains how the Apple team celebrated their innovative new product. So when it was all done, this is kind of like the first Mac. It says when the design was finally locked in, Jobs called the Macintosh team together for a ceremony. Real artists sign their work, he said. This is really fascinating. Listen to this. So he got out a sheet of drafting paper and a Sharpie pen and had all of them sign their names. The signatures were then engraved inside each Macintosh. No one would ever see them, but the members of the team knew that their signatures were inside, just as they knew that the circuit board was laid out as elegantly as possible. With moments like this, he got us seeing our work as art. Isn't that a great statement? And so the innovation, by the example of Steve Jobs, he took in how to marry something that's beautiful with something that's very functional. And so that, again, another quote by Wendell Berry on illustrating this idea of innovation here. Let me find it. That, let's see now. Yeah, that innovation is we are creating elegant solutions predicated on the uniqueness of every place. So we're creating elegant solutions predicated on the uniqueness of the place. Collaboration and cultural wisdom would give us the insight necessary for these elegant solutions crafted by local leaders for local challenges. So in other words, again, that we don't have to be content with just importing a franchise from another successful place. We can learn from that, and we need to learn from that. And there can be things that we can draw, but we've carefully thought about, do they fit our place? And so innovation starts with kind of an understanding of our place, what's going to fit for us, what's going to work for us. The authors Frost and Hirsch make this statement. It says that it sometimes seems as if there's some form of template at work in most churches all over the world, regardless of language and culture. That kind of all churches kind of look alike. And well, I think there are patterns and principles that should be found. The Methodist denomination has chosen there's certain patterns and principles, values that we want to hold to as a church. But the expression of that, we're not locked into a time and place, because how do we design something that's appropriate to our place, to our neighborhood, to our people? And we're going to keep, because of our culture, we're going to share certain values and language are going to be present, but the forms may be a little bit different than other settings, because that's what fits our neighborhood. And so that marrying imagination and innovation, is a fun process. For example, several years ago, and I outlined this in my book, that my friend and I were tasked to, within the Navigators, to create a training setting for a particular outreach strategy that we had. And so we started thinking, how do we move from just a typical workshop, seminar kind of approach to training that we used to? What if we come up with a whole different way of doing that? And do you know what we came up with as a different way of doing that? We created a board game. And we modeled this board game. Remember the old Ungame, the On Life game, and a little bit of the Monopoly game. And we created a board game. And we actually found a printer that could print the board that you could fold it up into like a, 1 foot square. And we found pizza boxes that were the size of that we could then mail the game out to people. And we had cards that people play, and they threw dice, and the game was all about values. about this particular outreach strategy. And so that we wanted to take kind of the function, that is the purpose of something. In this case, the purpose was thinking about outreach in some new ways, and we wanted to create a new form. And so we came up with a board game as an innovative way to do that. And so that board game is simply a means to the end of training people in this particular outreach strategy. And so it is with us as we think locally, that probably for a lot of us, we need to be thinking about, boy, do we need some new forms that fit our neighborhoods, that fit our settings, that as a local leader, we're faced with local challenges. What are the local strategies that we need to develop? And what are the local forms that we need to have? And so to do that, we need to have an innovative approach to do that. And so that, by the way, how do you encourage innovation? Let me just share one thought. This is really important, I think, for you as leaders. And let me just read from the book. We want to encourage loitering. Encourage loitering. It says in Greek and Roman mythology, the Muses were 9 goddesses who encouraged the arts and sciences. Over time, the 9 merged into the image of one woman, the Muse, who inspires creative artists. The verb form of muse means to be absorbed in thought, with an implication that creative thoughts can occur. The English word is derived from an old French word referring to the act of pondering or loitering. All right. So the word muse, you take it all the way back, and it comes from the French word of pondering or loitering. I enjoy this picture of loitering. Dictionary describes loitering as standing around without any obvious purpose. All right. When you combine musing with loitering, you form a picture of stopping to think so that inspiration can happen. To fuel the fires of innovation in a ministry or workplace, we must give people time to loiter, to stop and think so that inspiration can happen. Stillness is the most fertile breeding ground for ideas, writes one author. Frenzy is generally not a sustainable life strategy. So much of life comes down to us when we slow down, we have purposeful loitering. Why is slowing down important for creative insights? Much creativity and innovation results when we combine seemingly unrelated ideas or images together. This is the definition of a metaphor. Metaphors bridge two seemingly unrelated ideas that on the surface are not equivalent or related. When we relax, our minds are freer to make these associations because the brain is not preoccupied with solving a problem or completing a task. So in other words, when we kind of loiter, we kind of stop, we're kind of stopping to think, it gives our brain the ability to kind of, hey, explore some new ways, combining ways we haven't thought of things before, bringing us into some innovative ideas. What I find in working with pastors and church leaders is a lot of times that we are ruled by the tyranny of the urgent. And I've been there, I've been on staff at a church. And that so much of what happens is that we end up in a reactive mode rather than a proactive mode. Because we walk in, and some of you, even tomorrow morning, you sit at your desk and you're checking your email, your text messages, etc. And there's all these things you have to respond to. And so we're always responding, we're always reacting, and we seldom have time to kind of stop and loiter. And I encourage people, how can you carve into your weekly schedule? Can you take a 5% of your schedule? Maybe it's only 2%. Okay, I know everybody here works 40 hours a week. So, 5% is 2 hours a week, right? Yeah, 5% would be 2 hours a week. And maybe you can only take 2%. So that's an hour a week. Can you get an hour a week just to kind of stop? Say, Lord, hey, give me some ideas. I'm just going to stop and think. I'm going to loiter. I'm going to pause and I'm going to think. And that's a key to innovation. So I've talked about 4 things here that can kind of enlarge your portfolio of wisdom that we all need. And what are those 4 things? Again, lifelong learning. We need to be lifelong learners. All of life, all of ministry is this classroom God's teaching me in. 2 is that, hey, we need to be ministry collaborators, collaborative leaders, because there's wisdom in the community. And how do we tap into that wisdom to work together to come up with solutions and strategies? We need to be people who are cultural detectives, who are wise in cultural wisdom, that we understood our neighborhood, we understood our place, we understand our people. And we need to be ministry innovators. How do we come up with fresh approaches, fresh ideas, not for the sake of novelty itself, but it's fresh ideas that fit the place and fit the need. It's just not doing something to be innovative, to do something that's innovative, but it's designed to fit our need. That, again, this idea of a form follows function, that we have a function, purpose, goal, or a need, and we design a form that helps meet that. Let me say one last word here in closing, because my last book, my last chapter is about, I call it the choices we face, and that life is full of choices to seek one thing over another. Author Annie Dillard writes that we live in all we seek. Our lives are shaped by the decisions we make. As leaders, we must make some choices to grow in wisdom. In a world, without fixed answers or sure solutions, we must choose to follow the way of wisdom, a path with several forks in a road that require decision making. And so, in the last chapter, I have several choices we make as leaders. And one of the choices that I find myself, even in my age that I am, that I find myself choosing character over competency. That the longer we do things, and I was thinking about that the other day with we had our meeting last Monday with our senior leadership team, and we're just in the process of assessing some things. And one of the guys, kind of an outspoken fellow, says, "Hey, when are we going to stop talking and start doing something?" and and another guy says, "Yeah, I've been thinking the same thing." And I said, "Yeah, you're probably all wondering, when are we going to land this plane?" They said, "Yeah, when are we going to start doing something?" And I said, "Well, right now we're still in kind of the fact gathering stage." And but what occurred to these guys kind of complaints. I'd kind of stopped praying. I was trusting in my skill as a facilitator that everybody would be on board. Well, not everybody was on board. My skill didn't necessarily create this ideal setting. And what I had to choose at that moment in time was the choice of character. Had to choose to be patient, had to choose to listen, had to choose to be, yep, hey, to accept their input, right? You've all been in those situations rather than ramrodding something through. And so, what's been fascinating to me is you look at the pastoral epistles, that when they talk about the qualifications for deacons, elders, etc. One time I went through and I listed all of them, that the Apostle Paul lists. And I think there's 44 different qualities. Now, a number of them overlap. Some of them, words mean, the same thing, but he uses different words. But out of those 44 qualities that I counted, only two of them deal with competencies. You have the picture of the elders able to teach, and then they need to manage the household well, the household of God well. The rest all have to deal with character, who we are as people. And I found a lot of times, myself included, that in churches in particular, we can kind of choose people simply on a basis of, hey, he's an architect, a lawyer, or she does this, is successful, but, and we, instead of looking at what are the characters like? How are they going to work together? Are they loving people? Are they willing to serve others and the same thing for ourselves as leaders, that we're choosing to be men and women of character, of Christ likeness. That's what distinguishes us in the church. And however we define that, however we picture that, that it's all about kind of the character of the people that we are. And that is the thing I found, that in all of these qualities, these four things I've talked about, it's kind of like they're mediated through the character of our lives. I could be the greatest, collaborator, but hey, if I'm a domineering person, that's just not going to go over well. That character, they kind of all shine through that issue of character, and we all make character choices. I'm finding that, for example, one of my major growth points recently in the last couple of years was dealing with the success of another colleague of mine. I found, man, there's some jealousy on my part towards this individual. And I thought, that's really wrong. I thought at 74, I'd get over that, but I haven't. And so we're always dealing with character, and that's just an important choice. So let me summarize. It's 11 o'clock. And, the ways of the leader is about the fact that, hey, we're standing on that tennis court and we're getting all these balls of change being thrown at us, and we don't have time to set. And that we realize it's not one size that fits everything. There's not a quick fix. That what we need is local leaders. We need to develop local solutions or strategies for the local challenges that we face. And to do that, we need to have wisdom. And then how do we grow that sense of wisdom? Well, we grow that sense of wisdom by being what? A lifelong learner. and we draw on the wisdom of the community and ministry and leadership, collaborative leadership. You know, we're growing in our sense of cultural wisdom as cultural detectives, and then we're learning how to be innovative and trusting God again and working with others to come up again with local solutions and strategies to deal with local issues. So, with that thought, Judy, I guess we can now open it up for any questions. I can only see about a dozen of you on my
Great.
screen, so all of you stayed awake. I have no idea what happened to the rest of you out there, but we can open it up for questions now. So,
That's awesome. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and then you can ask your question, or if you prefer to type it in the chat and I will read it. While we're waiting for somebody to jump in, I'll tell you that Antonetta added the comment, wisdom also tells us when our strategies are not working also.
yes, good point. Yes, very good. Yep. And a lot of times that really does happen, doesn't it? Yes. Jeannie, I think you got a hand up.
I have, yeah. And first of all, thank you so much, Bill. This has been very interesting. The lifelong learning part, when we're supposed to maybe initiate a conversation because we want to glean information or, ways to do things or wisdom from other people. But I think I'm even guilty of this, of course, is we ask the question and they start answering, but then we turn it back to us
Yes,
and we
yes,
really don't listen completely for what we're
yes,
supposed to be gleaning.
yes,
So,
yes, yes,
so that will
yes.
remind me when I think about it,
Yes.
remind me to just to be reticent and quiet and gather what I can from them.
Yeah, very good. It's interesting. I had a conversation with a friend a couple of weeks ago on this very issue, Jeannie, and he made this statement. He says the most important question isn't the first question, it's the second question. Because the second question tells me I've listened to the person and I'm now following up on what they say. And I thought, boy, isn't that a great insight? So I learned something talking to Jim, and so I've been using that little statement. The most important question is the second one and not the first one, because that
Amen.
keeps the conversation going.
For sure. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Well,
Anybody else?
I think
What is
Sarah
the title of the book? The question was, what is the title of the book? And it's
It's
The Ways of the Leader, Four Practices to Bring People Together and Break New Ground. Right? By
and by
Bill
the way, like
Mowry.
all of you, if you want to visit my website, it's alongsider.com. And it'll give you a link on how to buy the book either on Amazon or from Nav Press that's published it. And yeah, it's alongsider.com and give you a little bit more about me, a bunch of free resources. Subscribe to my twice a month blog posting. But yeah, so that's a paid political commercial here.
I'm trying to type that in the
I did put
chat.
the ISBN number of the book in the blurb that we put out. So
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sarah, did you have your hand up?
Yes, one of the things that I found helpful was to get a demographic study to know what I was
Yes.
dealing with. And
Yes.
then I paid a visit to the city manager
Yes.
to find out what the needs were, how the the city manager saw the churches in the community.
Yes. Yes.
And I found that to be very helpful.
Yes. Excellent idea. Yeah, and that's part of being a cultural detective, isn't it? I'm asking some questions, trying to think, how is the church perceived? Yeah, that is excellent. That's well done.
And the third thing I did was to go to, well, a lowbrow restaurant in the town and
Okay.
just sit there and have lunch
Yes. Yes.
and listen.
Yes. Yeah. Excellent. Yes. Yeah, that gives us an understanding of place, doesn't it? Yes. Excellent ideas.
Marie's got her hand up. Go ahead, Marie.
By way of cultural wisdom, I think I wrote a few things that you need to understand this new culture because this new culture has its common language, practices, values, and history. So, at what point do you give suggestion of another culture that they may benefit from? In other words, they have the history, they have the culture, and they have been doing it that way. So a new person comes in. At what point do they learn from the new person?
Okay, I was a little hard of hearing you, so that
Oh, okay. Let me turn it up a little bit. You can hear me now? You can hear me better?
yeah, maybe a little bit more. Can you come up a little bit more?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
I was talking about your way of cultural wisdom.
Uh-huh.
And I said that, you have said that this culture already has its language, it has its history, and it has its values. And you are a newcomer. At what
Yes.
point do you make some suggestions?
As a newcomer coming
Yes,
in, very good observation. Yes, because a newcomer is not used to this particular culture, right? That
right.
you're coming into. And yeah, no, sometimes walking into a church can be like walking to somebody else's family reunion. You know, it seems like everybody else knows each other, but I'm the outsider to this. And um, man, this would be a great discussion for all of us to have. Let me just give you a couple, because again, it's hard to have this discussion with 40 people. Give you a couple of thoughts. I think that let's take it in a church setting, for example, that I think particularly churches that have a perhaps more of a liturgical order to what they're doing, that I think sometimes it's important. Like, for example, I walk into my Lutheran friends' churches, and I think this is a meaningful service, but I have no idea what these things mean. You know, I come from a different, tradition. And so I thought sometimes I think as the people leading the worship, I think it's okay every now and then to give a word of explanation why we do something or what this means to us. And so somebody coming in new says, oh, so that's why they do what they do, or that's why this is important. And it doesn't have to be a sermonette. It could be just one sentence. At this point in time, we weekly read the scriptures together, to hear the word read kind of thing, some a little, and that's why we do this. And so I found that if you could give some every now and then some one sentence definitions of why things are doing it. The other side is remember the trend a number of years ago, it was seeker friendly services. Remember, we all been through that. And so that you're trying to identify how do you design a service that anyone walking in kind of off the street would feel comfortable in. And I think that's a good goal to have. But on the other hand, you end up tossing out some of the traditions, some of the values that's helped define you as a church that are important to hold on to. And so that's what I'm saying. You need wisdom as local leaders to, discern what is the kind of things that, particularly in a worship setting, that both makes newcomers feel welcome, but at the same time doesn't mean we compromise what we believe in or value. By the way, we had this discussion yesterday again with this team I put together for senior ministry, and one of the couples has been new to our church in the last year. And so that it was interesting letting them talk about their experience of fitting into the church. And what we discovered, and this is another thing to do, like with new people over time, and I don't know how you handle new members classes. Sometimes these are the discussions you're going to have in a new members class is saying that how do you feel we're doing it helping you to fit in? What could have made you feel a little more comfortable? So we're actually asking people those kinds of questions. And so this couple I talked to yesterday in our senior planning team really had some good insights. They got involved, they just kind of stumbled onto things. And there was no clear communication that, hey, as a new member, here's some things that you could do. We failed to communicate that as a church. And so to answer your question, with somebody new coming in, they don't understand your values, etc. That one is that I think you can help explain some things. Two is that you always need to be sensitive as a church. How do we have people feel welcome, but without compromising what we stand for? And I think the other one is just asking and talking to people what their experiences are. And again, that gives you insight as church leadership. I hope that makes some kind of sense. I mean, that's a great question to discuss, but it's kind of hard to do that with this large of a group. But I think
Michael,
again, with that is I want to draw insight, wisdom, and understanding, right? And I think that say including in your new members classes, if you have those in whatever form they take, is even posing that question: what helps you feel welcomed? What could we have done more of? And that would give you some wisdom and insight into yeah, what we could do in terms of our practices, okay, that we have as a church. I
Michael has his hand up.
hope that made some kind of sense.
Thank you.
Hi,
Good
Bill.
question.
I'm Michael Edwards. I live in Tucson, Arizona,
Okay.
and I don't necessarily have a question, but maybe you have a response to this comment. I enjoyed the presentation, by the way. I heard some very good things out of it. But this particular comment I found interesting. You said, "Life's too short to work for people I don't like."
Now, I was being
No, 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 no. I
yeah,
like that
I was being tongue in
as
cheek
as
there.
I know I think that's a practical comment. However, I also heard, your particular congregation you talked about 65 and older
Yes,
being some 300 people, I think it was, that you
yes,
used, and that being one third or one fourth of the
yes,
congregation. I'm thinking that's a pretty big congregation.
yes,
And I'm thinking, but by the way, I probably don't have a lot of wisdom here in leadership, but and so let me preface that. Uh, but I can say from my experience in small congregations, we don't necessarily have the luxury of not liking someone,
yeah, I know.
and we learn to compromise for the bigger picture because
Yes,
you're happy to have a head there and a mind,
yes,
regardless of whether so you compromise with that person, whether you have camaraderie with them, whether you communicate with them, or same, a culture that connects or whatever, and you're just happy to have a head,
yes, yeah,
to
yeah,
really get something done. So you compromise and get it done.
yeah,
The
yeah,
big picture has to be, you gotta make something happen.
yes,
So,
yep.
I'm just interested in your response to that.
No, no, you're exactly. My wife always tells me, don't share that with people. They'll misunderstand you. But you're exactly right, because sometimes you don't have the luxury to pick and choose, right? And which is what you're saying. And so I totally agree with you. And that's why I think I paraphrased it. If you have that luxury, can you find people that you have some chemistry with? But sometimes we don't. Yeah, and yep. And that's why I think there's a fascinating passage. Maybe this addresses, Michael, what you're getting at. In First Thessalonians 5, 14, Paul says, "And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all." And so again, people need different things, Some people need admonishment, some people need encouragement, some people need help, but with everybody, we need to be patient. And yeah. So whether people we get along with or don't get along, and that's the first quality of love, right? 1 Corinthians 13. Yes, love is patient and kind, and yep, yep. Good,
Okay.
good, good comment. I'm glad you said that. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Gwen has her hand up.
Good evening. First, I have to tell you, I really did enjoy your book. I mostly enjoyed it because it was packed with good wisdom and good information, but it wasn't too long.
Oh,
Uh,
good.
but the one question that I had was about I didn't read the physical book. I listened to it on audio, and you referred to some resources that are not available on audio. Are those resources available on your website?
Yes, I believe they are. And Yeah, I think there was a collaboration audit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's on my website. Yeah, you probably have to go to I'd have to think about the specifics now. I know that's one of them that was there. Yeah, it was a collaboration audit. Yeah, that's the only one. I'm sorry, Gwen, that's the only one I can remember now.
Oh, there were things where you would say, okay, um, pause and take time to make a list of these things, these attributes that you would look for,
Okay.
things like that.
Yeah, so some of them are in the book, like there's some illustrations in the book that I probably refer to. And yeah, so in the appendix, there's a training exercise for, oh yeah, yes, because in the appendix of the book, there is yeah, there's a little audit to assess your choices.
Mhm.
Yes, in the appendix that there's a training exercise for lifelong learning. There's one for collaboration. Those are the things I probably referred to.
Okay.
Unfortunately, those aren't on my website, but I probably should put them on somehow. Um, so maybe, yeah, but yeah, so these are in the book, in the appendix, the written book. So I'm sorry they're not on my website.
Oh, just a suggestion, maybe you'll put them
Yes.
there for all your Audible users.
Yes, that's a good. Yeah, well, the publisher contacted me. Actually, they asked me if I was interested in reading the book myself. Sometimes the authors read the book, but I turned them down and I said, well, as long as you get a good Englishman reading my book so that I like the English. Yeah, so I don't know who ended up reading the book, but yeah, that is a really good point. I'll bring that up to my publisher. Yeah. So thank you. By the way, if I look odd when you start talking, it's because I'm trying to identify on the screen, out of these little 2-inch squares who's talking. Okay. So if I look funny when you ask a question, that's what I'm trying to do.
And Gwen, where are you at in the conference? What city?
I'm in Phoenix. I'm a member of Wesley United Methodist Church.
Awesome. Okay. So we might be able to share some of that resource with you. We have your email address. I'm looking at Jeannie from your registration. So maybe we can get you some help.
Yeah. I mean, hey,
Uh,
listen, I don't mind. You've got my permission. If you want to just copy those pages off and scan them and send them to her, yeah, that's fine with me.
that's awesome, Bill. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Great. Thank you.
Super. I'll make a note of that. Yeah. Because I'm over 65 and I'll forget.
Uh,
Well, one thing
Antoinette's
in the
had a
recording,
comment. Oh, go ahead, Michael.
I was just going to say it's in the recordings.
Yes.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
think we're
Yeah.
covered.
Antonetta commented that during the pandemic season, it was so hard to know the culture of our new communities and churches.
Yeah.
So when people I'm assuming you're talking about when people went to new churches. Our church
Yeah.
got a new pastor during the pandemic. And of course, we all got to know him through Zoom
Yes.
presentations. But he
Yes.
didn't get to know us. And
Yes.
that was kind of interesting.
Yes. Yeah, by the way, that's and I've encouraged pastors and leaders to do this. If you haven't done it, is to again, that was God's classroom, right? The whole COVID experience. And so have you sat down and talked about what did we learn from this? Yeah, what did we observe? What did we learn about our congregation, about connecting with people? All those kind of questions. And can how we answer those questions, can that influence how we think about church in the future? So that's it. Again, that's that idea of, reflection and action. Man, this thing happened, and have we gleaned the wisdom from it that could really be helpful for us? It's easy to keep going. That's right. Remember that? And the first point of being a lifelong learner is just need to stop. Just need to stop. And stopping and thinking sometimes is one of those, yeah, it's resisting the pull of the culture around us.
Any last question? comment?
Just want
Irene?
I didn't, thank you so much for taking the time out. I learned a lot of things to think about. I couldn't get in the chat, so I don't even, but thank you very much. I'm gonna read your book.
Oh, well, thank you, Irene.
Yeah.
Okay, seeing no other hands. We're going to thank you, Bill, for your time and interesting information. This was a great talk tonight. We appreciate you, especially
Oh.
staying up so late. It's almost 11:30.
Well,
So
thank you for
pray-
inviting me. It's always it's always, I think as a writer, and probably some of you are writers, you just never know when you write something where it's going to go and how it's going to be helpful, how God's going to use it in some way. And so to me, what I've learned over the years, that so much of the Christian life is, as I call it, a serendipitous experience, right? We're just surprised at what God does, where he shows up and where he takes us. And yeah, the Christian life, a lot of it's just marked by surprise. And so this is one of them. So thank you for inviting me in.
We were
Yes.
glad to meet you. It's great.
So to everybody, we hope you've enjoyed our presentation and that you'll join us again. Our next presentation will be on Monday, September 9th, and is titled Innovation and the Institution: Why Mobilizing 16% of Your Congregation Could Change the World. Our guest presenter is Reverend Rachel Gilmore. So thanks for everybody being here tonight. We appreciate it. We're getting all the thank yous in the chat, Bill. I know you can't see it, but thank you for the presentation. So we're hearing it from many people in the chat.
Well, thank you.
Oh, and we got thumbs up. Antonetta knows how to do
Okay.
the emotions. So thank you, thank
All
you,
right.
thank you.
Well, thank you. Have a good evening, everybody.
And you.
Bye
God
now.
bless. Bye-bye.
Bye.